قال رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم وإن كان لكافر قريب مسلم حاضر ولا ولي له كافر غسله المسلم كغسل خرقة النجسة لا يراعي فيها سنة التغسيل لأنه أي الغسل سنة عامة في بني آدم فيكون حجة عليه لا تطهيرا له. Right? So someone has an immediate non-Muslim relative. If the Muslim has a immediate non-Muslim relative that is with them, that is present, and they don't have a guardian, the deceased doesn't have a guardian, right? This would be in case of a family that has entered Islam, etc. Right? And this would not apply to the murtad, because al-murtad la millata lahu. Right? Right? It's ashad. But how that's dealt with, it needs some sensitivity. Like these kinds of issues, you leave them to the ulama. Right? And they don't have a non-Muslim guardian, because if they have a non-Muslim guardian, just give them to them. So Muslim would wash them like they would wash an unclean piece of cloth, not fulfilling the sunnahs of washing in it, right? But one washes fully, right? That's right. So one doesn't make wudu first and wash 3 times, just one washes it fully. Why? Because that is a sunnah with respect to all the children of Adam from the time of Sayyidina Adam, is to wash and bury the deceased. Right? And practices the contrary are exceptions in history, right? And they're considered aberrations, because it's from the karama. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. It's from the inviolability of the human being. Right? But this would be a proof against them in a sense, but it does not purify them. حتى لو وقع في ماء نجسة في ماء نجسة في ماء نجسه, right? What do you have, Omar? Yeah, نجسه, right? Yeah, so some copies say najisa, should be najasahu, right? Right? Such that if they fell into water, they would make it najis. This is on the issue that the najasa of the mayyit is of khabath, right? But the other, that the najasa of the deceased is just a hadath, then this would not apply even to the non-Muslim. Right? وَكَفَنَهُ فِي خِرْقَةٍ مِنْ غَيْرِ مُرَاعَاةِ كَفَنِ السُّنَّةِ. And they would wrap them in cloth without the sunnahs of shrouding. وَأَلْقَاهُ فِي حُفْرَةٍ. And one would cast them into a grave, meaning مِنْ غَيْرِ وَضْعٍ, right, without all the sunnahs of how you take them down, etc. Because they لم يلتزم ذلك في حياته, because these rules are not rules that they took on in their life. كالجيفة, like a dead carcass. مراعاة لحق القرابة, to fulfill the rights of family. But alqahu doesn't mean you throw them, like people overread into a text. The tamthil, like one would wash a dirty piece of cloth, right? The najis piece of cloth, you wash it fully to clean it. So the tamthil is in that. People read all kinds of more into it. Yeah. And so one washes it, one does not fulfill the sunnah. Alqahu does not mean, it's just to mean to put them into it without all the taking down. Doesn't mean you like, you say 1, 2, 3, let's smash him into the grave. Because the whole point is there's a haqq of qaraba, right? Fulfilling the rights of family. So it doesn't mean that you have to because otherwise, if you have to harm the deceased, then you wouldn't wash them. You'd maybe use a hammer on them or something, right? That's not the case. So just be read things as they are. Don't misread them, but don't read into them either. Right. أو دفنه أو دفعه القريب إلى أهل ملته. Right? Or one would give the close, the immediate family member to the people of their faith to conduct their ceremonies. وَيَتْبَعَ جَنَازَتَهُ, and one follow their funeral من بعيد, from a distance. And the بعد, it's not just بعد مسافة, but بأن لا يشارك في المراسم الدينية, that one would not participate in their religious rituals themselves. Right? 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 And then he says, وفيه إشارة إلى أن المرتد لا يمكن منه أحد لغسله. And in this is an indication that the murtad, that the apostate, no one would wash them. لأنه لا ملة له, because the apostate is not considered to have a religion. Right? So a Muslim becomes a Christian, we consider them an apostate. Right? So we would not, فيلقى كجيفة كلب في حفرة. So they're just thrown like a dog's carcass in the hole, and they're muhan shar'an, right? And it's now the asl of any Muslim is that they're Muslim, right? They're Muslim. So there's people who they have tadabdub, they go this way or that. So كل ما أمكن حمله على الأصل فيحمل على الأصل. Anyone whom we could consider they're Muslim, they're considered Muslim, and we don't investigate. Right? Someone who's born to Muslim parents, right? They had strange views, etc. Right? The ulama say very explicitly, you need considering, like so there. Right? نعمل بالظاهر. We just go the outward. Someone born in a Muslim family, what are they considered? Muslim, right? And whether they're not, that's between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they're Muslim. So, but they're secular. So what did they really believe? Let's go check all their social media statuses and let's go check this. And you piece together the evidence and you say, okay, considering all the evidence that we have in mind, that we could find, and someone hacks their email, they believed in Satanism, or they followed whichever of the new atheists. No, not necessarily. And all of that is indicative of a sickness in the person. Just because someone reads something, they say, ناقل الكفر ليس بكافر. The one who relates disbelief is not a disbeliever. Right? That requires some sensitivity, right? Some sensitivity. And those matters are left to the ulama, right? Because these are waqa'i'. These are things that happen. So how they're dealt with, right? وإلى أن الكافر لا يمكن من قريبه المسلم. A non-Muslim is not allowed to take care of the funerary proceedings of the Muslim. لأنه فرض على المسلمين كفاية, because it's a collective obligation for the Muslims. This, of course, in the sense that if the non-Muslim wants to pay the funerary costs, whatever, أهلا وسهلا, but how would a non-Muslim know what the Muslim rituals are, etc.? The assumption is that they wouldn't. But if they want to be there, again, that's one of those waqa'i al-hal, because historically, people would take their religion, they would affirm the sanctity of religious rituals, right? That people follow religion as truth, not just as a cultural phenomenon. Right? The secularized notion that, well, this is the customs that we follow. Right? So it's just a custom or religious, it's just religious traditions. Right? No. So people took that very seriously, right? So for a Christian or a Jewish person to participate in Muslim funerary, but if someone wants to and they want to be there, that requires sensitivity and right? And it depends on circumstances, right? And they say at-tabi' tabi', that we get Muslims to do the funeral practice. Someone wants to be there, there's no harm. Similarly, if someone was very close to their non-Muslim neighbor, who they're same age, they grew up together, whatever, they want to be there in the ghusl, etc. And they say, okay, I'll take care of the whole thing. So it'll be done in the Islamic Center's funeral thing. They want to be there. That returns to the family, ultimately the family's judgment. They should consult the ulama, but these things require sensitivities. It's also, there's the bab of da'wah there, of calling that person to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in those moments, right? Okay. وَلَا يَدْخُلْ قَبْرَهُ لأن الكافر تنزل عليه اللعنة والمسلم يحتاج إلى الرحمة خصوصا في هذه الساعة. And the non-Muslim would not enter the Muslim's grave, right, in placing them down, because the disbeliever la'an descends upon them, while the Muslim is in need at that moment for mercy. خصوصا في هذه الساعة, especially in this moment. Okay, so now he has other of these assorted issues. So he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَلَا يُصَلِّ عَلَى بَاغٍ, when one does not pray over rebels, right? الباغي من خرج بالسلاح على طاعة السلطان, right? Is someone who rebels, and rebellion here is not people who are protesting, etc. The baghi is the one who takes up armed rebellion, like military rebellion against the Muslim state, even if even if they have their shortcomings, right? اتفاقا وإن كان مسلما, by agreement, even if they are Muslim. And there's some tafsil in this, right? That ultimately it returns to the judgment of the ruler. They can decide that they're not prayed on at all, or that they're not prayed on publicly, or they're only prayed on privately, that some people pray over them, and it would depend on the various scenarios, right? وَلَا عَلَى قَاطِعِ طَرِيقٍ, nor upon a highway robber. إِذْ قُتِلَ كُلٌّ مِّنْهُمْ حَالَ الْمُحَارَبَةِ, right? If they are killed during their rebellion or fighting, or during their highway robbery. Why? Because there is a maslaha amma, right? والمصلحة العامة تقدم على المصلحة الخاصة, right? The public interest is given precedence over the private interest while striving to preserve both. So, but in this case, the public interest is that there not be rebellion, that there not be highway robbery. So this is they're made an example of, that people they're not prayed over, right? And that's why it returns to the judgment of the rulers. Then they could be in a state of battle or not in a state of battle. And the ruling in a state of battle, they're not prayed over. Why? And they're not prayed over and they're not washed, right? And there's tafsil, you can see some of the different opinions under in Tahtawi and elsewhere. The basis is لأن سيدنا عليا رضي الله تعالى عنه لم يغسل البغاء, because Sayyidina Ali رضي الله تعالى عنه did not wash and not pray over those who the rebels who were killed in the state of rebellion. Right? And right? Now here, this is not what's there in the Imdad, right? So something happened in the abridgment here, in the Maraqi, because the Imdad says, then Sayyidina Ali, it come that he did not pray over the rebels. لم يصلي على البغاة. Right? Omar, if you could just look that up in the Lubab. In the Imdad. Right? And in the copies of the Maraqi, are you aware of this divergence? Okay. So it is, but in the Imdad, it appears to say, that Sayyidina Ali did not pray over the rebels. وَأَمَّا إِذَا قُتِلُوا بَعْدَ ثُبُوتِ يَدِ الْإِمَامِ عَلَيْهِمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ يُغَسَّلُونَ وَيُصَلَّ عَلَيْهِمْ. But if they're killed after the Imam has captured them, after the rulers have captured them, so they're executed, then they would be washed and prayed over. And it's the judgment of the Imam. Are they prayed over privately? By privately, just a few people pray over them, or in a limited capacity, or publicly. And generally, of course, it wouldn't be from wisdom that we, because the rebels might be popular. So, okay, let's have Salat al-Janaza at al-Masjid al-Jami' for them. Of course not. So and that returns to, to the Araf. Did you find anything on that?
Yeah, seems to be what he said.
What? Yeah. Yeah. Right, and the same thing. So the footnote here in our copy is, for once, half reasonable. Right? That's what's mentioned in the Imdad, and the same text can be found in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq and by Zayla'i in Nasb al-Raya. Okay? And Zayla'i did an amazing job. Like, he gathered the evidentiary base. He didn't just reference the hadiths in the Hidayah, but he gathered a lot of the core proofs of the Hanafis in a summary way. So even other great hadith scholars like Ibn al-Humam and others benefit tremendously in their quoting hadith from Imam al-Zayla'i. Some people like quoting Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri saying that he read Nasb al-Raya and read Fath al-Qadir. I think he said there are only 4 hadiths that Fath al-Qadir mentions that are not in Nasb al-Raya. But that's hyperbole. That's not an A equals B thing. Right? All we take from that is there's only a limited number of hadiths that are in Fath al-Qadir of Ibn al-Humam that are not in Nasb al-Raya. But there's other distinguishing points of Fath al-Qadir in hadith, particularly the usuli approach to hadith, right? The application of Hanafi interpretive principles to the hadith. And in that sense, Fath al-Qadir is more distinguished than Nasb al-Raya. But Nasb al-Raya, just in the body of textual of the hadith evidence, is really remarkable. Allah. ولا يصلى على قاتل بالخنق غيلة بالكسر الاغتيال يقال قتله غيلة وهو أن يخدعه فيذهب به إلى موضع فيقتله والمراد أعم كما لو خنقه في منزل لسعيه في الأرض بالفساد. Right? And one does not pray over someone who kills another by treacherously strangling them. And then he explains what ightiyal, treachery, is, right? Which is to deceive someone, take them to an empty place and then kill them. But similarly, if they did so, there's someone broken at night and they murdered the family, etc., because they're spreading corruption on earth. Right? So this is meant to, and again, this returns to the judgment of the ruler. How do we deal with these kinds of scenarios, right? Because it's meant to serve as a deterrent and a warning. وَلَا يُصَلَّى عَلَى مَقْتُولٍ عَصَبِيَّةً إِهَانَةً لَهُمْ وَزَجْرًا لِغَيْرِهِمْ. Likewise, one does not pray over someone who was killed due to partisanship. Two tribes are fighting over something they forgot about. Okay? Our tribe is fighting their tribe, right? Like what happened between Romeo and Juliet, or between the families of Layla and Majnoon, so many others, right? And, Dr. Fuad said, I was once overcome by tribal allegiance. I said, what? See, if there's one of the scholars said something unbecoming of one of the Ba'alawi scholars. So Dr. Fuad went to visit him at the hotel in London. And he knew this sheikh well. He went and he's walking with a stick, and he says, Sheikh, I respect you. You are of the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ. But if you ever speak ill of my shuyukh, then know that we Nahdis, we are a warrior tribe. But we gave up our weapons to serve the Sada of the Ba'alawi. If you speak ill of any of them, I don't care who you are, I will be at enmity with you until the end of my life. And then my children will be at enmity with you and your children. And their children will be enmity with your grandchildren. And like this until my family forgets and your family forgets why we're at enmity with each other. But we will remain at enmity with you. And I started waving my stick in the air. That's Dr. Fuad. He says, then what do you do? Then I said, Assalamu alaikum. He went down the corridor, and there's sofas, at the end of the corridor. He just sat down there, said for a while. Next day, the sheikh was like, thank you for your advice, I've taken it to heart. I said, you weren't really going to do that. He said, do you think my children will be at war with anybody? I said, no. He said, I just lost my mind, but we are a warrior people. Don't get on my wrong side. I said, I won't. But people had these strong tribal allegiances. But the Prophet ﷺ, this was, people are, خَلَقْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah, tells us in the Quran that we have created you as shu'ub, as peoples, right? Shu'ub, وَقَبَائِلَ, and tribes, qabila. So people have this tendency, but has a tendency for it to be a separate, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may come to know one another in good ways, whether worldly or next worldly. Right? But do not take pride in your shu'ub and your qaba'il. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. Inna is for ta'keed. Is man? أَتْقَاكُمْ. Your sharaf is not by your tribe, which peoples you're from, which tribe. لا كرامة إلا بالتقوى. Right? And as Imam al-Haddad says in his Ba'iyya, in the Wasiyya that ends with the letter Ba, and leave the folly of those who just say, Kana Abi, my father, my forefathers were such and such. Right? Because their virtue won't benefit you if you live in vice. نسأل الله العافية. What?
I don't think we read the line. وَلَا عَلَى مُكَابِرٍ فِي النِّصْرِ لَيْلًا بِالسِّلَاحِ.
Okay. وَلَا عَلَى مُكَابِرٍ فِي الْمِصْرِ لَيْلًا بِالسِّلَاحِ إِذَا قُتِلَ فِي تِلْكَ الْحَالِ. And likewise, one does not pray over one who's come out openly in a town at night with weapons. If they're killed in that state, they're not prayed over. And again, it returns to the judgment of the rulers, of the authorities. Right? And laylan, right? Imam al-Tahtawi and this is, Allama, if you read the biography of al-Tahtawi, he's a great scholar. He says here, he does not mention the exclusions, فَحَرِّرْهُ, right? So check this out, right? And sometimes you find that some of these issues where he pauses, he's being so cautious, right? Because, a Sayyid, for example, I'm not sure here if a Sayyid talks about it, Sayyid Abu Saud in his commentary on Nur al-Idah, but he won't have commented. So he'll be very careful. Right? See? But many of the ulama said that the laylan, at night, this is a qayd ittifaqi. Someone who comes out, because in cities are places of safety. Al-ghalib fil, that cities are places where there's rule of law. Right? So normally it's inconceivable that someone comes out in a city, in the normal case, right? Unless there's fitna. In the normal case, someone would come out in a city and brandish their sword, come out with their weapons, because there's police there, there's authorities, right? But if they did that by day, the same thing would apply. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. Right? And likewise, not for the one who dies in tribal battle without any basis, as a humiliation for them and to warn others, not for that. وَإِن غُسِّلُوا, even if they are washed. Right? كَالْبُغَاةِ عَلَى إِحْدَى الرِّوَاتَيْنِ, as is the case with the rebels in one narration, that they would still be washed over. Right? لا يصلى عليهم, but they're not prayed over. وإن غسلوا, that narration says they're not prayed over even if they're washed. And there's the tafsil, the aqwal here, they're not على التباين على اختلاف الحال. The different narrations about how to deal with the bughat, about the rebels, they depend on, because there are different considerations. So there are different opinions, but they come together, that it returns to this, what's called a siyasa shar'iyya, to the judgment of the rulers of what protects the public interest and prevents the harm. وَقَاتِلُ نَفْسِهِ, and the one who commits suicide. عَمْدًا لَا لِشِدَّةِ وَجَعٍ, right? The one who kill themselves deliberately, not out of intense pain. يُغَسَّلْ وَيُصَلَّ عَلَيْهِ, they are still washed and they're still prayed over. عند أبي حنيفة ومحمد وهو الأصح, and this is the strongest opinion. لأنه مؤمن مذنب, because they're a believer who committed a sin. وقال أبو يوسف لا يصلى عليه, Imam Abu Yusuf said they're not prayed over. وكان القاضي الإمام علي السغدي رحمه الله يقول الأصح عندي أنه لا يصلى عليه وإن كان خطأ أو لوجع لا يصلى عليه. Right? So Imam Sughdi used to say that the stronger position, according to me, as Sughdi was one of the relatively earlier Imams, that he said, according to me, the strong opinion is that they're not prayed over, right? And the position of Abu Yusuf was taken by some of the scholars in the madhab, which is why the opinion of Abu Hanifa is described as being asah. And you can see Mawlana al-Tahtawi explaining that, right? In the Ghaya fi Sharh al-Hidayah, chose that, etc. But the Mu'tamad is the first one, right? The relied upon position is the first one. But also, and this is important to keep in mind, so suicide is a sensitive matter, right? Even though many of the books of fatwa do mention, and some of the books of fatwa in the Indian subcontinent also take that position, but when who kill themselves deliberately, لا لشدة وجع, not out of intense pain. If there's intense pain, there's a shubha. The pain could be physical, but there's other types of pain as well. Right? So that's why people have to have a little bit of humility and a little bit of empathy towards people. The act remains wrong, but you have to have empathy for the person. They died a believer. They committed a sin. Right? The hadith about the intensity of punishment for the one who kills themselves applies to the one who's not in a state of distress. Right? Right? Because لِضُرٍّ أَصَابَ, because of a distress that befell them, that is because due to a slight distress that befell them. It's still wrong. A person should not kill themselves. But then there's the general case, there's the distress, and then there's situations where someone goes outside moral accountability. And you don't know if they were morally accountable or not when that happened. So we act by the outward, right? But don't, like, these things require sensitivity, right? That's where, how do we deal with these situations? One consults the ulama. And sometimes sensitive issues, right? Sensitive issues, one raises them to people who are more learned, right? More learned. Sometimes the imam of the local masjid may not know how to deal with the issue, etc. They've never dealt with a case like that. So they may react, they may have read a hadith, whatever they may not, right? So rather than, so sometimes if you run into a closed door, you can keep trying to bash your head into the door, you can just go around, find another door, right? But these are common issues, right? And you see the sensitivity here. It says, وَإِن كَانَ خَطَأً, if it was an error, that's also a possibility. How do you know how they died? Why read into it? They died, so they blew their heads. And what if they're looking at the gun and they tripped on the carpet and they shot and they blew their whole brains into the ceiling? So, they killed themselves. What if it's an accident? Right? الأصل حمل تصرفات المكلفين على وجه الصحة والسداد حيث أمكن بلا تكلف. This principle of Imam al-Karhi is such an amazing principle. The basis is that we interpret the actions of those morally responsible in a manner that was valid and sound whenever it's possible without takalluf. An error. Someone, they tripped. Or just say, I don't know. Right? I don't know. And assume validity and keep going. Or due to overwhelming pain. أو لوجع. Right? If it was an error, or due to pain, meaning overwhelming pain. So they're in, حالة اضطرار. Which of course does not validate the act, but it gives more evident excuse. Right? So they are preyed upon by agreement. Right? So you see the sensitivity which this is dealt with, right? Radiyallahu ta'ala an ulama'ina, right? And that's where also there's an arrogance. Because of the ignorance leads to arrogance, right? Ignorance on the part of many who talk about the rulings of the Sharia without basis, right? People are on the boards of masjid and making religious decisions. No, I read this hadith. You cannot pray upon the person who did suicide. The hadith doesn't even mention praying upon the deceased. It talks about the sinfulness of killing yourself. What do you know what the hadith means? I read the Saudi or whichever country's translation and footnotes. Right? So then it causes a counter reaction that, they say the ulama need to understand about mental health issues, etc. Okay? Maybe you should understand a little bit about ilm first. Right? Right? And these things have been dealt with great sensitivity and nuance. Right? وقاتل نفسه أعظم وزرا وإثما من قاتل غيره. The one who kills themselves is more sinful an in graver error than the one who kills another, insofar as the first thing you're responsible for is yourself. Right? Right? But this is in the general case. This is in the general case, not in the case of grave pain, distress, etc. Right? The action remains wrong. We say the action is wrong. We suspend judgment about the one who did it. We say the action was wrong. Right? And then you have to pay attention to the living. Pay attention to the living. Allah. وَلَا يُصَلَّى عَلَى قَاتِلِ أَحَدِ أَبَوَيْهِ عَمْدًا. And one does not pray over one who killed one of their parents deliberately. As opposed to by mistake. They're all staying, they're living in Texas and the heating is out. So, the child's sleeping on the bunk bed, the father in fragile health sleeping on the ground. The child fell from the teenage son fell from the bunk bed onto the father, and and the father died. That's khata. Like that's not what it covers, right? وَظُلْمًا, ظُلْمًا, in a state of wrongdoing, إِهَانَةً, out of abasement to them. نستغفر الله سبحانه وتعالى العظيم. So that is the section on janaiz. Then he talks about how one carries the deceased and how one then buries them. So we'll take that بإذن الله تعالى next بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. Before we close, any questions?